At my sister's wedding in Manhattan, my own mother called me a used product, while 200 people laughed and my 5-year-old son squeezed my hand like he was trying to hold me together. Here's the part that still haunts me. My sister didn't freestyle that humiliation. She planned it. And the one man who didn't laugh did something so surgical it detonated the entire room. And my family never recovered. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to take you back to that ballroom, but not the polished version people post on Instagram, the real one. The one that smelled like champagne, hairspray, and quiet cruelty, dressed up as family humor. Picture the Carol in Manhattan, that kind of hotel where the carpet feels thicker than your whole apartment, where the elevators whisper, where the staff glides like they're trained not to make eye contact with anyone who doesn't look expensive. I walked in holding my son Ethan's hand, and I already knew we didn't belong there, not because I couldn't behave, not because I couldn't dress up, but because my family had decided years ago that I was the kind of daughter you put in the corner, and then you forget exists until you need a punching bag. Ethan was 5, wearing a tiny navy vest and khakis, his hair combed so neat it made him look like a little gentleman. He squeezed my hand the way kids do when the room is too big and the grown-ups are too loud. "Mommy," he whispered, eyes wide at the chandeliers, "it's so pretty." I told him it was, because I didn't want his first memory of something beautiful to be stained by my bitterness. We found our table, and I felt my stomach drop, because table 23 wasn't just far, it was strategically far, tucked behind a pillar close enough to the service doors that every time the kitchen swung open, heat and shouting leaked into our corner, like a reminder that we were basically seated with the staff. If you've ever been placed somewhere on purpose, like somebody wanted you visible enough to know you were excluded, but hidden enough to not matter, drop a comment that says, "I know, so I know I'm not talking into the void here." I sat Ethan down, smoothed his collar, and did that thing I've done my whole life, the thing women like me do when we were raised to be agreeable. I swallowed it. I told myself it was one day. I told myself I was here for my sister. I was here for family. I was here to do the right thing, because that's what the workhorse daughter is trained to believe, that the right thing is always absorbing the wrong treatment with a smile. Across the room, my parents were doing their rounds like politicians. My mother looked expensive in champagne Valentino, my father in a tailored Armani suit, and they were basking in compliments about their beautiful daughter, singular, as if I had been a rumor. My sister Vivian floated in like she owned air itself, in a Vera Wang gown that probably cost more than my rent, and when she looked at me, she smiled, but it wasn't warmth, it was the smile of someone checking a box, confirming that the prop had arrived. She stopped at our table like she was doing charity. "Morgan, you came." "Of course," I said, because what else do you say when your sister speaks to you, like she's surprised you made it out of the basement? Her eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to me. "Just remember what I said about keeping him quiet." Then she turned away and disappeared into the crowd, and in that moment I felt a cold little ping in my chest, because it wasn't about Ethan being quiet, it was about Ethan being small, contained, convenient, like my motherhood itself was a stain she didn't want near her white dress. The ceremony happened, beautiful on the surface, the kind of vows people clap for, the kind of string quartet that makes your skin hum. And I tried to let myself feel something normal. But it was hard to feel normal when you're sitting in the back with your child on your lap like you're a liability. During cocktail hour, the photographer called for family portraits, and I stood automatically, because I'm her sister, because I'm family, because it's a photo, because it's normal. My mother appeared with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just the immediate family for this set, Morgan." I blinked. "I'm her sister." "We're doing a smaller grouping first," she said in that tone that sounds polite but is actually a command. "You understand." I did understand. I always understood. Ethan tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, why can't we be in the picture?" And that question hit harder than any insult, because kids don't understand hierarchy, they understand belonging. I told him we'd take our own pictures later, and I pulled out my phone and took a photo of him instead, because I didn't want his face to remember my face breaking. The reception started, speeches queued up, glasses clinked, laughter rose, and I watched it all from our corner, like I was watching a party through a window. I noticed Daniel's friend, Mike, setting up a phone on a little tripod near the dance floor, angled toward the stage. I assumed it was for relatives who couldn't come. I didn't realize it was about to become evidence. Then the MC called my sister up to speak, and Vivian took the microphone with the ease of someone who's practiced being adored. She thanked everyone. She thanked Daniel. She thanked my parents, and my parents ate it up like it was oxygen. Then she started talking about family, and I felt my spine tighten, because that word in my family doesn't mean love, it means leverage. Her gaze found me across the room and stayed there. Not sister to sister, predator to prey. "Morgan," she said into the mic, voice bright, "could you stand up? I want everyone to see you." 200 faces turned toward our corner. The sudden attention was like a spotlight turning your skin into paper. My legs felt heavy, but I stood because when you've been trained your whole life, you stand when they call you, like a dog that still thinks it's going to get petted. Ethan looked up at me, confused, and whispered, "Mommy, Aunt Viv is talking about you." I squeezed his hand and forced my mouth into something that resembled a smile. Vivian's voice turned sweet in a way that made my blood go cold. "This is my big sister, Morgan. She taught me so much about life." And then she hit the first punchline. "See, my sister is a single mother." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, like she'd been waiting years to say them into a microphone. A few guests shifted, but most leaned in like this was entertainment, because people love cruelty when it's packaged as a joke and they aren't the target. Vivian continued. She got married young, had a baby, and then, well, things didn't work out. She did the little sympathy head tilt, the one that says poor you while actually meaning look at you. Her husband left her. Couldn't handle it, I guess. Nervous laughter trickled through the room. My face burned. Then she went for the throat. "My sister is unwanted. No man wants her. I mean, can you blame them? She's got baggage now." The laughter got louder, bolder, and I felt my body do something weird, like I was floating outside myself, watching this happen to somebody else, because that's how your brain protects you when humiliation becomes trauma. And then my mother, from the head table, contributed like she was proud of her own cruelty. Clear as a bell. She said she's a used product. The room erupted. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. The kind where people throw their heads back. The kind where my father covered his mouth to hide a smirk, like a teenager. The kind where strangers felt comfortable laughing at a woman they didn't know because her own mother had given them permission. I looked down, and Ethan's little face was crumpled. Eyes wide, confused, hurt. He whispered, "Mommy, why is everyone laughing at you?" And I swear to God, that question did something to me. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet internal snap, like a rubber band that had been stretched for 32 years, finally breaking. But I still didn't move. I couldn't. I was pinned by the shame and the shock and the disbelief that the people who made me could also enjoy breaking me in public. Vivian rode the laughter like a surfer. "Morgan taught me exactly what not to do," she said, raising her glass toward me. "To Morgan, my cautionary tale." And people raised their glasses. Some looked uncomfortable, but they still raised them because most people would rather blend and then be brave. I stood there, exposed, while my son watched his mother become a punchline. If you've ever been the scapegoat in a room full of cowards, comment "scapegoat" right now, because I need you to stay with me for what happens next. Vivian kept going, warming up, and I realized with horror that this wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. Her cadence was too smooth, her pauses too perfect, like she'd practiced this in front of a mirror. "Growing up, everyone asked why we were so different," she said, pacing the stage like a performer. Same parents, same house, same opportunities. But Vivian succeeded, and Morgan, well, she gestured at me like I was a prop. My mother dabbed at her eyes like she was emotional. But it wasn't empathy. It was laughing so hard she was tearing up. My father stared down at his plate when the room quieted, the way men do when they're complicit but don't want responsibility. Then Vivian delivered the line that I still hear sometimes when it's quiet at night. Some people are meant to be warnings, not examples. And the room applauded. Actual applause. That's when Ethan whispered, voice cracking, "Mommy, I want to go." I bent down and kissed his forehead and I whispered, "We're going," but I still couldn't move because my body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And that's when I saw Daniel stand up. He pushed his chair back slowly, and the sound of it scraping the floor cut through the laughter like a knife. The quartet stopped playing. People froze mid-sip. Vivian's smile flickered, just for a second, like she didn't expect consequences in a room where she had always been protected from them. Daniel didn't look at her. He didn't perform. He didn't rage. He walked toward the stage with that calm, purposeful stride of a man who has spent years in courtrooms, a man who knows that when you speak next, the room will have to listen. Vivian tried to laugh it off, tried to keep control. "Daniel, baby, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He reached the stage and took the microphone from her hand, not snatching it, just removing it, like confiscating something dangerous from someone irresponsible. The ballroom went silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Daniel looked straight toward our table, toward Ethan's shaking shoulders pressed against my side, and something in his face hardened. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke like he was delivering a closing argument. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, voice steady, "but there's something I need to say." He told them he'd watched this family for 2 years. He said he'd watched dinners where I was ignored, holidays where I was treated like furniture, moments where my parents laughed at me like I was entertainment. Vivian grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Stop, you're embarrassing me." He stepped away from her touch like it burned. "No, Vivian," he said into the mic, and the way he said her name made it clear he was seeing her for the first time. Not as his fiancée, but as a person capable of cruelty. "You did that yourself." He said he was a children's rights attorney, that he spent his life protecting kids from family trauma, and then he pointed at Ethan, and my chest tightened because I realized he wasn't defending me, he was defending my son. "That little boy is 5 years old," Daniel said, voice tight now, controlled anger. "And you just made him watch 200 adults laugh at his mother." Nobody laughed anymore. My mother's face went pale. My father stared at the table like it might swallow him. Daniel repeated the words my sister and mother had used, and when you hear cruelty repeated back without the party lighting around it, it sounds like what it is, abuse. Vivian tried to whisper. It was just a joke. Daniel's laugh was short and dead. "A joke," he said. "You planned this. You rehearsed this. You turned your own sister's pain into entertainment." Then he said the words that made the room inhale as one organism. I can't marry you, Vivian. I won't." Gasps, murmurs, a stunned ripple moving through 200 people who had been happy to clap for cruelty but weren't prepared to watch it cost someone. Daniel nodded toward the phone on the tripod, the live stream still running. "About 50 people have already witnessed exactly what kind of family I almost married into," he said. Then he set the microphone down gently, like he didn't need theatrics, and he walked off the stage. The room didn't explode right away. It hesitated, like everyone needed a second to decide what story they were going to tell themselves about what they'd just witnessed. And then my mother surged toward me, not with shame, not with apology, but with rage, because in her mind the problem was never what she did. It was that someone finally made her pay for it. She jabbed a finger at me. "What did you do?" she hissed. "What did you say to him?" My father followed, face hard. Vivian stood up, mascara starting to smudge, and in seconds they started rewriting reality out loud. I was jealous. I poisoned him. I ruined her day. And I could feel the crowd turning, because crowds love a simple villain, and I was familiar, I was convenient. That's when I looked down at Ethan, really looked, and I realized I had a choice. Keep being the woman who absorbs it, or become the woman my son needs to watch. I stood up calmly, lifted Ethan into my arms, and my voice surprised even me because it was steady. "I didn't say anything to Daniel," I told them. "I didn't need to. He has eyes. My mother opened her mouth to argue, and I didn't let her. I turned and started walking toward the exit, back straight, steps measured, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave without begging to be understood. As I walked, I heard my mother shout, "Morgan, you come back here and apologize right now." And I didn't even flinch. Ethan's cheek was wet against my shoulder. "Mommy," he whispered, "are we going home?" "Yes," I said, "we're going home." The ballroom doors felt like a finish line. I pushed through them into the quiet hallway, and the air outside the ballroom tasted different, cooler, cleaner, like I'd stepped out of a toxic room and remembered what oxygen is. Daniel was near the doorway, not running, waiting, and when I reached him, he spoke low, so only I could hear. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have said something earlier." I shifted Ethan on my hip and met his eyes. "You just saved my son from watching his mother be humiliated while everyone pretended it was normal," I told him. Daniel handed me a simple white business card. "If you ever need anything," he said, "legal help, a reference, anything at all, call me. Pro bono. I mean it." I nodded, tucked the card away, and kept walking because I was still in survival mode, still trying to get my kids somewhere safe. When we finally got into a cab, Ethan asked for pancakes, like the night hadn't just cracked something in me. And I promised him pancakes with all the chocolate chips, because 5-year-olds don't process betrayal, they process comfort. But here's what my family didn't understand yet. Public humiliation is a weapon, and when you use it, you're betting the victim will stay quiet out of shame. They bet on the old Morgan, the one who swallowed everything. They didn't account for the fact that a camera had been rolling, and more importantly, they didn't account for the fact that the quiet daughter eventually stops being quiet when she finally sees the damage it's doing to her child. Later that night, after I tucked Ethan into bed and listened to his breathing settle, my phone started to light up like a warning system. Missed calls, voicemails, texts full of blame. And then, among the noise, I got a message from someone I barely expected to notice me at all. And attached to it were screenshots that made my hands go cold, because they proved this wasn't an accidental joke, it was a coordinated attack planned weeks in advance. And if you're sitting there thinking, "Morgan, why didn't you swing back? Why didn't you expose them right then?" Understand this. When you've been trained your life to be the quiet one, your first reflex is survival, not vengeance. But that reflex was about to change, because my phone was about to show me proof. When I finally got home that night, the apartment felt smaller than usual, like the walls had leaned in to listen. Ethan fell asleep almost instantly, the way kids do when their bodies are exhausted from emotions they don't yet have words for. And I stood there in the dim light of his room, watching his chest rise and fall, thinking about how close I came to teaching him the worst lesson a child can learn, that when people hurt you and laugh, you're supposed to stand there and take it. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in that gray dress, makeup, smudged heels, kicked off like evidence from a crime scene. And that's when my phone started to feel heavy in my hand. 47 missed calls, 31 from my mother, 12 from my sister, 4 from my father, each one a variation of the same theme: blame, panic, control. I didn't listen to the voicemails at first, because I already knew what they'd say. "How dare you? You embarrassed us. You ruined everything. You owe your sister an apology." And that familiar old reflex kicked in, the one that says, maybe if I just explain clearly enough, they'll finally understand. But before I could spiral into that place, a text came through from a number I didn't recognize at first. And then I saw the name Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister, the one who'd always hovered on the edge of family gatherings, like she was there out of obligation, not love. And the message was short and careful. "Morgan, I watched the live stream. I am so sorry. I had no idea they were capable of that." And that sentence cracked something open in me, because it was the first time in my life anyone in my family had acknowledged that what was done to me was wrong, not misunderstood, not exaggerated, not sensitive, just wrong. If you've ever waited decades for someone to finally say that word, comment finally, because you know exactly what that relief feels like. The tears came then, quietly, the kind that don't make noise because you've learned to cry without disturbing anyone. And I sat there wiping my face when my phone buzzed again, this time from my best friend Rachel, who never sugarcoats Anything, don't read anything until you call me, she texted, and then immediately sent another message, never mind, you need to see this now. And then the screenshots started loading one by one, and my heart started pounding because I recognized the format immediately: a family group, chat the kind I'd been removed from months earlier after asking why I wasn't. Invited to Christmas Eve dinner, and the title alone made my stomach drop. Ingram family. No Morgan. The messages were dated 2 weeks before the wedding. And as I scroll, my hands actually started to shake, because there it was in black and white: Vivian, writing, I'm working on my speech. I think I'm going to call her out in front of everyone, make her see what a disappointment. She is my mother, replying, just don't go too far, sweetie. We don't want to look cruel. And Vivian firing back, she deserves it. She shows up with that kid. Like she's not ashamed. Someone needs to put her in her place. And then the message that hurt more than all the others, my mother saying, you're right, she's always been an embarrassment. Just make it funny. People love a good roast. And my father chiming in, don't mention me. She won't say anything back. She never does. And that was the moment the story inside my head changed forever. Because up until then, some small, stupid part of me had still been hoping. Maybe it went too far. Maybe it was a bad joke. Maybe they hadn't really meant it. But this wasn't a joke. This was a plan, a coordinated attack, dressed up as celebration. They hadn't just humiliated me. They had scheduled it, rehearsed it, anticipated my silence, counted on it. And I sat there staring at those screenshots, thinking about every holiday, every dinner, every moment I'd felt small, and realized none of it had been accidental. I was the designated outlet, the family pressure valve, the one they could cut open to feel better about themselves, and the realization didn't make me scream. It made me calm. A cold clarity settled in like fog, lifting. I walked into Ethan's room again and watched him sleep, dinosaur nightlight casting shadows across the wall. And I thought about what kind of world I wanted him to grow up in, and suddenly the answer was a simple one. Without them, I opened a notes app on my phone and typed 2 words, no contact. That was it. No dramatic goodbye, no explanation letter, no final confrontation. Because I knew them well enough to know any words I offered would just be twisted into more ammunition. Silence wasn't weakness anymore. Silence was an exit strategy. One blocked my mother's number, then my sister's, then my father's, and sat there waiting for the guilt to crash into me the way it always had. But it didn't. Instead, there was this strange, quiet relief, like setting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying your whole life. And just when I started to breathe again, the next move came. Because people like my family don't accept loss of control. Quietly, 3 days later, they showed up at my apartment, unannounced, my mother in a cashmere coat, my father looking uncomfortable in my hallway like he'd wandered into the wrong life. Ethan was with me. And when he saw my mother, his grip tightened on my hand. Mommy, why is Grandma here? And that question alone told me everything I needed to know. I asked Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, to keep him inside with cookies. And once he was safe, I stepped out into the hallway and faced them. My mother went straight for accusation. You blocked us after what you did to your sister. And there it was again, the rewriting, the gaslighting, the refusal to acknowledge reality. I told her calmly, I didn't do anything. Your daughter humiliated me in front of my child, and you helped her plan it. And when I said that, something flickered in her eyes, fear, because she knew I knew now, and fear makes people crueler, not kinder. She accused me of jealousy, of poisoning Daniel, of destroying the family's reputation. And I let her talk because I wanted to hear it with new ears, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a grown woman watching manipulation in real time. And then I told her I'd seen the screenshots, the color drained from her face, and for the first time in my life, I had proof. She couldn't deny. She tried anyway, of course. She did, saying it was out of context, saying Vivian was stressed, saying I was overreacting. And that's when I interrupted her, something I'd never done before. I said, you called me a used product in front of my son, and you're standing here asking me to apologize. And the silence that followed was thick. My father finally spoke, quietly saying, your mother is upset. And I realized that was all he had to offer, a lifetime of neutrality that always somehow landed on my side of the wound. I told them they needed to leave, that I would not raise my child in an environment where abuse was treated like family humor. And my mother tried one last move, the guilt trip. When I'm gone someday, you'll regret this. And I looked at her and said, maybe, or maybe I'll know I protected my son from the damage you did to me. And when she reached toward Ethan, I stepped between them and said no. And that single word felt more powerful than anything I'd ever said before. If you've ever had to say no to someone who raised you, comment no, because you know how much strength that takes. After they left, my phone lit up again, texts from relatives, whispers, starting to move through the family, because the video had escaped the ballroom and started circulating. And here's the thing they never expect. When they humiliate you publicly, they forget the public includes witnesses who talk the same family network that once spread rumors about my divorce and my failure to keep a husband was now spreading the truth. And I didn't lift a finger, Vivian. Tried damage control, a long Facebook post about misunderstandings and playful family dynamics. And the comments tore it apart because people had eyes and ears and video proof. My mother tried calling relatives, trying to manage the narrative, but you can't spin footage of yourself laughing while your daughter is called unwanted. And something else happened, something quieter. Daniel called me weeks later to apologize. Not for what he did, but for what he didn't do sooner. And he offered help, legal support, anything, because he said your son deserves someone in his corner. And so do you? And in that moment, I realized something profound. The people who show up when you're at your lowest are your real family, not the ones who share your blood. And as months passed, my life started to rebuild in small, unglamorous ways. I got promoted at work. Ethan started kindergarten. I started therapy and learned a word that changed everything. Scapegoat, a role assigned in dysfunctional families, so others don't have to look at themselves. And when you leave, the system collapses or redirects. And that's exactly what was happening behind me. But I wasn't looking back, because the more distance I put between myself and them, the more I could hear my own thoughts again. And those thoughts were saying, you survived, you protected your child, you broke the cycle. And if you're still here listening, ask yourself this question: would you ever laugh at your child's pain? And if the answer is no, why tolerate it from anyone else, especially family? And here's what's coming next. Because the story doesn't end with walking away, it ends with what happens when the family that relied on your silence has to face itself without you. And trust me, that reckoning is louder than the wedding ever was. And you're going to want to hear how it unfolds. So stay with me and tell me in the comments, have you ever been the one who walked away first? After the door closed behind my parents that afternoon, the silence in my apartment didn't feel empty. It felt earned, like the kind of quiet you get after a storm finally passes. And the air doesn't smell like electricity anymore. Ethan sat at the kitchen table swinging his legs, eating cookies like nothing monumental had just happened. And that contrast almost broke me, because that's how abuse survives. It hides inside normal moments until you think it's just life. I watched him and thought about how close I came to teaching him that love means swallowing humiliation. And then I thought about how that lesson had been drilled into me since childhood, and I realized the hardest part wasn't cutting them off. The hardest part was unlearning what they taught me about myself. The days after the wedding blurred together, calls through relatives, messages sent through friends of friends, a constant low-level pressure, like the family system was trying to pull me back into orbit. My Aunt Linda called often, checking in not to interrogate, but to listen. And one night over the phone, she told me something that stuck with me. She said, Morgan, when you left the room, everything shifted, like someone pulled out the load-bearing wall, and the rest of the family didn't know how to stand anymore. And that's when I started to understand something psychologists talk about, but we don't name enough in real life. When you're the scapegoat, you're not the weakest link, you're the stabilizer, the one everyone else leans on while pretending you're disposable. And when you remove yourself, the dysfunction doesn't disappear, it just turns inward. And that's exactly what started happening. Vivian spiraled first, according to Linda. She couldn't go anywhere without someone bringing up the video. She tried to laugh it off, tried to frame it as people being too sensitive, but the more she defended, the worse it got, because nothing exposes cruelty faster than watching someone refuse to own it. Her workplace started asking questions. Clients didn't like the optics of PR professional whose idea of humor was public humiliation, and my mother took that as a personal attack. She called relatives daily, trying to explain, justify, rewrite, but every explanation sounded worse than the last, because the truth had already landed, and once people see something clearly, you can't unsee it. My father retreated the way he always did: silence, avoidance, golfing longer hours, pretending nothing was wrong, and I used to feel sorry for him, but therapy helped me see that silence isn't neutral, it's a choice, and it always sides with the louder voice. Growing up, his quiet had trained me to doubt my own reactions, because if it was really that bad, wouldn't he have said something? But now I saw it clearly. He didn't protect me, because protecting me would have cost him comfort. And that was a price he never wanted to pay. If you've ever had a parent who stayed quiet while someone else hurt you, comment silence, because I know that wound is deep. Meanwhile, my own life started changing in ways that felt almost suspicious, like the universe was checking to see if I was serious about choosing myself. My supervisor pulled me aside at work and told me I was being considered for a senior charge nurse position, and I remember standing there nodding professionally while my brain screamed because for years I'd internalized the idea that I was just barely good enough to survive, not someone people chose to lead. Ethan started kindergarten and came home one day proudly, telling me he helped another kid tie his shoes, and I cried in the bathroom because kindness is learned, and somehow, despite everything my family put me through, I had managed to raise a gentle child, and that felt like proof that I wasn't broken, just bruised. Therapy peeled back layers I didn't know existed, sessions where I talked about the prom dress I bought myself because my mother said I was simple, the bedroom by the utility closet, while my sister had a balcony. The way praise in our house was rationed and always went to the same person. My therapist said something that reframed my entire life. She said, "You weren't competing with your sister, you were auditioning for parents who needed you to lose." And that sentence explained decades of confusion, because no matter how hard I tried, how responsible, how accommodating I was, the rules were rigged. I wasn't supposed to win, I was supposed to stay useful and invisible. And when I stopped playing the game, they panicked. The first crack came when my mother sent a birthday card for Ethan, no return address, a $100 bill inside, like money could replace accountability. I put the cash into his college fund and recycled the card because access to my child is not something you buy, it's something you earn. Then Vivian tried contacting me through a mutual friend saying she wanted closure, which is a word people use when they want forgiveness without responsibility. I didn't respond, and that silence did more to unsettle her than any argument could, because she was used to me reacting, used to me defending, used to me explaining. And now there was nothing to push against. My father showed up at my hospital one afternoon, standing awkwardly in the lobby, and for a moment I almost reverted to that old posture, the one where I try to make things easier for him. But instead I listened while he talked about how upset my mother was, how hard things had been since the wedding, and then I asked him a simple question: did you ever once tell them to stop? And he didn't answer because there was no answer. That didn't indict him. And I realized then that reconciliation requires two things: remorse and change. And my family offered neither, just consequences they didn't like. And the thing no one prepares you for when you cut off toxic family is the grief, not just of losing them, but of losing the fantasy that someday they'd become who you needed them to be. I grieved the mother I never had, the father who never intervened, the sister who chose cruelty over connection. And that grief came in waves, sometimes while folding laundry, sometimes while driving, sometimes while watching Ethan sleep. But it passed, and each time it did, it left me stronger, not harder. Just clear the video kept resurfacing in unexpected places. A coworker mentioned seeing it on social media. An old cousin reached out to apologize for not speaking up sooner. And each time someone acknowledged what happened, it chipped away at the gaslighting I'd lived under my whole life, because gaslighting only works in isolation. Once the truth is shared, it loses power. Daniel checked in once, sending a short message wishing me and Ethan well. No pressure, no expectations, just decency. And I appreciated that more than grand gestures, because consistency matters more than drama. I started dating cautiously, coffee dates, walks, nothing serious, but the experience of being listened to without being minimized felt revolutionary, like learning a new language where I didn't have to translate my pain into jokes to make it palatable for someone else. And slowly the question that had haunted me since childhood started to fade. What did I do wrong? Because the answer became obvious. Nothing. The system was wrong. And when systems are wrong, you don't fix yourself to fit them. You leave and build something better. And here's the part people don't like to hear. Healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like blocking numbers and choosing peace over performance. And that choice doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. My mother still tells people I'm unforgiving. My sister still paints herself as the victim. My father still avoids uncomfortable conversations. And that's okay, because their story no longer defines me. Ethan drew a family tree for school recently, just two figures, me and him holding hands. And when I asked if he wanted to add anyone else, he shook his head and said, "This is our family, mommy," and that drawing now sits on our fridge like a quiet manifesto. This is what matters: safety, consistency, love without conditions. And if you're watching this wondering if walking away will destroy your family, let me tell you something: honest staying is what destroys you. and sometimes leaving is the only way to survive long enough to build something healthy. And the next part of the story goes somewhere unexpected, because when the scapegoat leaves, the family doesn't heal, it looks for a new target. And what happened after I stepped out proved just how fragile their version of unity really was. And you're going to want to hear who took my place and how fast everything unraveled. So tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed what happens when the quiet one finally walks away? Once I stepped fully out of their orbit, something unexpected happened. The chaos didn't stop, it just changed direction, like water looking for the next crack. And that's when I learned the most uncomfortable truth about families like mine. They don't actually want harmony, they want hierarchy. And when the person at the bottom refuses to stay there, the structure starts hunting for a replacement. The first sign came from Aunt Linda. Again, her voice, low, almost guilty, when she called me late one evening. Morgan, I don't want to upset you, but you should know this. Your mother and Vivian are at each other's throats now. Actual screaming matches, not passive-aggressive jab screaming. And the reason was so absurd it almost made me laugh. My mother had started criticizing Vivian the way she used to criticize me. Her weight, her tone, her attitude, her failure to keep Daniel and Vivian, who had built her entire identity on being the favored one, suddenly didn't know how to survive without a shield. And this is the part no one tells you about favoritism. It's a fragile throne built on the promise that love will stay as long as you perform perfectly. The moment the golden child falters, the love turns conditional and vicious. And I could hear it in Linda's voice when she said, I think Vivian finally understands what it felt like to be you. And that didn't make me feel triumphant, it made me tired, because empathy that only arrives through personal suffering is a shallow thing. My mother had lost her favorite audience when Daniel walked out and the extended family stopped clapping, and now she needed someone to unload on, and Vivian was the only one left in range. My father still didn't intervene. He never did, but now his silence worked against Vivian instead of me, and watching that dynamic flip felt surreal, like observing an experiment I'd lived inside for decades. From the outside, for the first time, my phone buzzed with messages from cousins I barely spoke to, some apologizing, some asking questions, some clearly fishing for gossip. And I learned quickly who wanted connection and who wanted entertainment. And if you've ever had people show up only when there's drama, comment vultures, because you know exactly what that feels like. I kept my circle small. Rachel, Aunt Linda, my therapist, my co-workers who knew me as Morgan, the nurse, not Morgan, the family disappointment. And that distinction mattered more than I ever realized, because for years my identity had been filtered through my family's narrative, and now I was meeting myself unedited. I started noticing things about myself. I liked my patience, my humor, the way I handled stress at work, the way my colleagues trusted me with hard cases. And those were things my family never acknowledged, because acknowledging them would have threatened the story they needed to tell about me. One afternoon, after a long shift, I sat in my car and realized I hadn't thought about my mother in hours, and that felt like progress, not numbness, just space. And space is where healing actually happens. Vivian tried reaching out again, this time with a longer message, sent through a mutual acquaintance. It was full of therapy, language, accountability adjacent, but empty. I'm reflecting, I'm growing, I want to clear the air. And I read it twice, then deleted it, because clearing the air without naming the smoke is just performance. And I wasn't interested in playing my old role anymore. My father sent a text a few weeks later, just 3 words, I'm sorry. And for a moment, I stared at the screen, wondering what version of sorry that was. Sorry I got caught, sorry you're mad, sorry things are uncomfortable now. And I realized it didn't matter, because apologies without change are just another way to reset the cycle. And I wasn't resetting anything. The most interesting shift happened inside me, though, because once I stopped defending myself, I stopped needing validation, and that's when the anger softened into something steadier, resolve. I started building routines that belonged only to me. Sunday pancakes with Ethan, morning walks before school, therapy every Thursday night, and those rituals became anchors, proof that life doesn't implode when you choose yourself. It actually stabilizes. Ethan noticed the difference. Kids always do. He asked fewer anxious questions, slept better, laughed more. And one night while we were brushing teeth, he said, Mommy, you don't cry in the kitchen anymore. And that comment hit harder than any insult my family ever threw, because it showed me how much I'd been carrying quietly and how visible that weight had been to a 5-year-old child. I hadn't protected him by staying, I'd protected my family by staying, and that realization rewired everything. Months later, a family event came up, a cousin's graduation, and Aunt Linda asked if I was going, and I felt my stomach tense, automatically the old reflex ready to calculate seating charts and exit strategies, and then I surprised myself by saying no and feeling fine about it, not guilty, not dramatic, just uninterested, because peace has a way of recalibrating your tolerance for nonsense. My mother tried one more tactic. She sent a letter, handwritten, dramatic, full of memory references and emotional leverage, talking about sacrifices she made, how hard motherhood was, how she did her best. And I read it with compassion and distance, because two things can be true. She struggled, and she still chose to hurt me, and acknowledging her pain didn't erase my own, and that's a lesson. A lot of people miss empathy. Doesn't require access. You can understand someone and still say no. I put the letter away and didn't respond, and that silence did something profound. It ended the conversation entirely, not temporarily, not dramatically, just completely. And that's when I knew I was done. The family system had no leverage, left the phone, stopped ringing the messages, slowed the drama, found new targets, and I faded into something they hated most. Irrelevant. And meanwhile, my life kept expanding quietly. I took Ethan to the Children's Museum on weekends, started planning a small birthday party for him. Just friends, cake, too much frosting, laughter, no hierarchy, no humiliation, just joy. And while blowing up balloons, I thought about the wedding again, not with pain, but with clarity. That night wasn't my breaking point. It was my release. It exposed the truth. So publicly, there was no going back to denial. And if that microphone had never been handed to Vivian, if my mother hadn't laughed, if Daniel hadn't stood up, I might still be trying to earn scraps of affection from people who saw me as disposable. Sometimes the most painful moments are also the most clarifying. And if you're listening to this wondering if you're overreacting, if your family really is that bad, if maybe you should just let it go, ask yourself this: would you ever treat your child the way they treat you? And if the answer is no, why are you accepting it from anyone else, especially people who claim to love you? Comment that question below, because I want you to sit with it. The next phase of this story goes deeper, because cutting contact doesn't mean the damage disappears. It means it finally has space to surface, and the work of rebuilding yourself begins. And that process is messy, emotional, and full of unexpected revelations about who you are without the labels they gave you. And the next part is where I talk about what it actually took to rewire 32 years of conditioning, and why walking away was only the first step, not the hardest one. And if you think you're ready for that truth, stay with me and tell me in the comments, what was the first boundary you were afraid to set? What no one prepares you for after you walk away isn't loneliness, it's the identity withdrawal. Because when you've spent your whole life being defined in opposition to someone else, the moment you stop showing up to be compared, you're left staring at a version of yourself that never got airtime. And that's where the real work started for me, not in the dramatic exits or blocked numbers, but in the quiet mornings where no one was telling me who I was supposed to be or how much space I was allowed to take. I started noticing how often my first instinct in any situation was to apologize, even when I hadn't done anything wrong, how my shoulders stayed tense, like I was bracing for impact, how praise made me uncomfortable because it felt like a trap. And those realizations were unsettling, because they meant the damage wasn't just external, it had been living inside me for decades. Therapy stopped being about processing the wedding and started being about excavating a childhood where love had been rationed like a resource you only got if you proved you deserved it. My therapist had me do this exercise where I listed memories I thought were normal, and then we looked at them through an adult lens, and suddenly things like being praised for being low maintenance or the easy one stopped sounding like compliments and started sounding like instructions to disappear. And if that's resonating with you, come an easy one, because you know how that label quietly erases you. The hardest part was realizing how much of my personality had been shaped around avoiding conflict, because conflict in my family always ended with me being blamed. So I learned to anticipate needs, smooth tension, make myself smaller, and that skill served everyone except me. At work, it made me reliable. In relationships, it made me accommodating, and with my family, it made me invisible and unprotected. And once I saw that pattern I couldn't unsee, it suddenly every interaction felt like a choice, not a reflex. And that was exhausting at first, because when you stop running on autopilot, everything requires intention. Saying no required thought resting required permission, enjoying something, without guilt required practice. And some days I felt like I was learning how to be a person from scratch. Ethan helped more than anyone because kids don't negotiate. Authenticity. He noticed when I laughed more, when I stopped flinching. At my phone when I started humming while cooking dinner. And one night while we were building a dinosaur puzzle, he looked up at me and said, "Mommy, you're nicer now." And I laughed because the idea that I had been less nice before stung until I realized what he meant. I was lighter, more present, less guarded. And that comment became a checkpoint for me. Am I choosing peace or am I performing survival? My family's absence created space for new connections too. Not dramatic replacements, but steady ones. A neighbor who invited us over for Sunday soup, a co-worker who brought me coffee after a rough shift, a school mom who asked if Ethan wanted a play date, and none of those relationships came with hierarchy or conditions. They were simple, mutual, respectful. And I realized how starved I'd been for that simplicity. The guilt crept in occasionally, of course, especially on holidays when social media filled with curated family photos, and I wondered if I was being too harsh, if I should just forgive and move on. But then I remembered forgiveness doesn't require proximity, and moving on doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means building a life that doesn't revolve around old wounds. My mother tried one last strategy. She sent a message through Aunt Linda saying she was sick, nothing serious, just enough to provoke concern. And I sat with that for a long time before deciding not to respond, because urgency has always been her lever, and I refused. To be pulled back by fear Ethan's well-being mattered more than managing my mother's emotions, and that was the clearest sign I'd changed. The old me would have rushed and hoping sickness would soften her. The new me understood that crisis doesn't equal accountability, and compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. My sister faded from my thoughts almost completely, which surprised me because rivalry had been such a constant backdrop of my life. But without the competition enforced by our parents, she was just another person making choices I didn't respect, and that indifference felt like freedom. I focused instead on tangible goals, saving for a better apartment, planning a small vacation for Ethan, and me enrolling in a leadership course at work, things that invested in a future rather than reacting to a past. And slowly my internal narrative shifted from what did I do wrong to what do I want next? And that question was terrifying because it came without scripts or approval, but it was also exhilarating because it was mine alone. And here's the truth that surprised me most. The anger didn't disappear. It transformed. It became protective instead of corrosive. It showed up when someone spoke over me, when a boundary was tested, when a familiar pattern tried to reassert itself. And instead of swallowing it, I listened, because anger, when used correctly, is information. It tells you something matters. It tells you something is crossing a line, and learning to trust that signal changed everything. The wedding that once felt like the worst night of my life became a reference point, not for pain, but for contrast, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd survived. And if you're watching this wondering when it gets easier, I won't lie to you, the grief comes in waves, but so does the relief. And over time, the relief lasts longer than the grief, especially when you build a life aligned with your values rather than your conditioning. The next chapter of this story isn't about revenge or closure in the way movies sell it. It's about the quiet, undeniable consequences that unfold when you refuse to play your assigned role anymore, and how the people who relied on your silence are forced to confront the vacuum it leaves. And that part is where the illusion really cracks, because when you stop absorbing the damage, it has nowhere else to go. And if you want to understand what finally happened when my family realized I wasn't coming back, and how that realization changed the power dynamic permanently, stay with me and tell me in the comments, what part of yourself did you have to unlearn to start healing the moment my family realized I wasn't coming back? Didn't happen with a dramatic phone call or a tearful apology. It happened in fragments, through silence, through unanswered messages, through birthdays that passed without acknowledgement, through holidays that went quiet on my end and louder on theirs. Because when you remove yourself from a dysfunctional system, the system doesn't collapse immediately. It rattles. First, it searches for the missing peace. It assumes you'll return to your post. And when you don't, panic sets in. That panic showed up in unexpected ways. My Aunt Linda told me my mother started hosting elaborate dinners again, inviting extended family, neighbors, old friends, anyone who would listen to her version of events. She reframed the wedding as a misunderstanding, as a joke that went too far, as a moment blown out of proportion by an overly sensitive daughter. She needed an audience, because without me present to absorb the blame, She had to redirect it somewhere else, and when people didn't react the way she expected when they asked uncomfortable questions about the video, about Ethan, about why Daniel walked out, she grew brittle sharper, more defensive, and that's when I knew something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time her narrative wasn't landing unchallenged. My father withdrew in his own way, stopped attending gatherings, stopped engaging in the performance of normalcy that my mother relied on. He retreated into routine's Gulf television silence, and Lindis said he looked older, diminished, like someone who'd lost the map he'd been following for decades and didn't know how to draw a new one. My sister Vivian reacted differently. She oscillated between rage and self-pity one week, posting motivational quotes about resilience and forgiveness, the next venting to mutual acquaintances about betrayal, how I'd stolen her happiness, how Daniel had humiliated her, how everyone had turned on her unfairly. She wanted consequences reversed without accountability. She wanted the ending rewritten without changing the beginning. And when that didn't happen, when people stopped validating her outrage, she did something she'd never done before. She tried to reach me directly, not through guilt, not through manipulation, but through a message that simply said, "Can we talk?" And I stared at that message for a long time, longer than I expected, because there was a version of me that still wanted resolution, still wanted to believe that if we just had one honest conversation, everything could be repaired. But then I remembered honesty requires safety, and history had taught me that vulnerability with my family was ammunition. So I didn't respond, and that non-response was louder than any argument I could have made, because it forced her to sit with the discomfort she'd always outsourced to me. At the same time, my life continued expanding in small, meaningful ways. Ethan learned to ride his bike in the parking lot behind our building, wobbling, determined, laughing every time he tipped over, and I cheered like he'd won a marathon. We started a Friday night ritual, pancakes for dinner, pajamas, early a movie on the couch, something he called our cozy night, and those routines grounded us. They created predictability where chaos used to live at work. I began mentoring a new nurse fresh out of school, anxious, eager, reminded me of myself years ago, and I caught myself offering reassurance, guidance, things I'd never received. And in those moments, I realized healing isn't just internal, it's generational. It's the decision to interrupt patterns, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you. And then the call came, the one I didn't expect. My father asked to meet me alone, neutral territory, a diner, halfway between my apartment and their house. I almost said no, but something in his tone, quite stripped of authority, made me curious. So I went not for reconciliation, but for information. I needed to understand what he was capable of and what he wasn't. He arrived early, sitting in a booth, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders, slumped eyes, tired. We talked about inconsequential things. At first, the weather, Ethan's schoolwork, until he finally sighed and said, "I don't know how we got here." And that sentence held more weight than any apology, because it acknowledged failure without deflection. I told him I didn't either, but I knew where I was going, and that didn't include pretending nothing happened. He asked if there was any chance of rebuilding, and I told him maybe someday, but not now, not until accountability came before access. And he nodded like he understood, even if he didn't fully agree. And when we parted, there was no hug, no resolution, just a quiet acceptance that something had ended and something else uncertain had begun. What struck me most afterward was the absence of guilt. I'd braced myself for emotional fallout, for regret, for the ache of filial obligation, but instead I felt calm, grounded, like I'd finally aligned my actions with my values, and that alignment was addictive. I began noticing how often women like me are taught to endure under the guise of loyalty, how family is weaponized as a moral shield to excuse behavior we'd never tolerate from strangers, and I started speaking about it more openly with friends, coworkers, even other parents at Ethan's school. And the response was overwhelming, story after story of people carrying similar wounds, of being the responsible one, the forgiving one, the one who kept the peace at their own expense. And those conversations reinforced something vital, that this wasn't just my story, it was a pattern, one that thrives on silence and collapses under truth. My mother made one final attempt months later, sending a handwritten letter filled with nostalgia, selective memories. Photos of me as a child, smiling at birthdays, vacations, moments curated to suggest happiness. And at the end she wrote, "We were a good family once." And I almost laughed, because that sentence encapsulated everything. We were never good. We were functional until we weren't, and functionality without kindness isn't love, it's convenience. I didn't respond, but I didn't burn the letter either. I tucked it away, not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but as evidence of what I'd survived, because survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, incremental, the courage to keep choosing yourself even when no one is clapping. And as time passed, the distance between who I was and who I'd become widened enough that the old roles no longer fit. I wasn't the scapegoat or the afterthought or the warning example. I was a mother, a professional, a person building a life on her own terms. And the more I embodied that, the less power my family had over my emotional landscape. Their opinions faded into background noise, occasional echoes rather than defining forces. And if you're wondering whether they ever truly understood the impact of their actions, I don't know, and I don't need to know, because closure doesn't require consensus, it requires clarity. And I had that clarity, now the clarity that says you don't owe proximity to people who hurt you repeatedly, you don't owe explanations to those committed to misunderstanding you, and you don't owe access to your child to anyone who models cruelty as humor. And here's the part people don't tell you about boundaries: they don't just protect you, they reveal others. When you stop participating in dysfunction, those invested in it will either adapt or escalate, and watching which they choose tells you everything you need to know. My family chose escalation, denial, blame, revisionism, and that choice sealed the door not with anger, but with certainty. And if this part of the story resonates, if you've ever wondered what happens after you walk away, after the dust settles, after the noise fades, tell me in the comments what fear held you back the longest. Because naming it is often the first step to loosening its grip. And stay with me, because the final chapter isn't about them at all. It's about the unexpected ways peace shows up once you stop negotiating your worth, and how that peace changes everything you thought you needed to prove. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, layered, almost heavy, the kind of quiet you feel in your chest before you understand what it means. And that's when the real reckoning began, not with my family, but with myself. Because when you spend your whole life reacting to other people's chaos, you don't immediately know what to do when the chaos stops. I woke up some mornings disoriented, reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting a missed call, a guilt message, a demand. And when there was nothing, just the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the steady breathing of my son down the hall, it felt unfamiliar, like standing in a room after a loud concert ends and your ears are still ringing. I had to learn how to exist without bracing myself, and that learning curve was steeper than I expected. Peace sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice it can be unsettling, because peace doesn't tell you who to be. It doesn't hand you a script. It just waits and asks, what do you want now? And for someone who had spent decades being what everyone else needed, that question was terrifying at first. I didn't know what I wanted beyond safety, beyond not being humiliated, beyond not shrinking myself to make others comfortable. So I started small. I wanted mornings that didn't start with dread. I wanted evenings where laughter wasn't followed by criticism. I wanted my son to grow up without learning that love comes with conditions. Those wants became anchors. They guided decisions, big and small, when to answer the phone, when to ignore it, who to let close, how much of myself to give. And over time, those choices stacked into something that felt like a life rather than a reaction. And then something unexpected happened. People started treating me differently, not because I demanded it, but because I carried myself differently. When you stop negotiating your worth, you stop broadcasting vulnerability to exploitation. Coworkers noticed, friends noticed, even strangers sensed it in the way I spoke, the way I held eye contact, the way I didn't over-explain, and that shift rippled outward. Opportunities opened. Conversations, deepened, connections felt reciprocal instead of draining, and I realized something that should have been obvious, but wasn't. Your environment adapts to the boundaries you enforce, not the ones you fantasize about. And that realization reframed everything I used to believe about loyalty and sacrifice. Loyalty without mutual respect is just submission. Sacrifice without appreciation is just depletion. And family loyalty that requires you to accept abuse isn't loyalty at all, it's captivity. And once I named that, the guilt began to lose its grip, because guilt thrives in ambiguity. It feeds on shoulds and maybes and what ifs. But clarity starves it, and I was clear now about what had happened, about what was unacceptable, about what I would never allow again, not for myself, Not for my child, not for anyone I loved, and then the moment came, the one I hadn't anticipated, the one that tested whether my boundaries were real or theoretical. It happened on a random Thursday afternoon. My son was at school. I was folding laundry, half listening to a podcast, when there was a knock at the door, not the casual knock of a neighbor, but a deliberate, insistent one. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up, because some part of me recognized that knock, and when I opened the door there, she was my sister standing in the hallway, eyes red, face drawn, stripped of the confidence she'd worn like armor for so long. She looked smaller, now fragile, and for a split second, old reflexes surged the urge to comfort, to fix, to take responsibility for her pain. But I caught it, held it, examined it, and let it pass, because empathy doesn't require self-betrayal. She spoke first, her voice unsteady. I didn't know where else to go, and that sentence carried years of entitlement in it, the assumption that no matter what she did, no matter what she said, my role would remain intact. I would be the landing pad, the safety net, the one who absorbed the fallout. So she didn't have to, and I realized in that moment that this was the final test, not because she was evil, not because she deserved punishment, but because my response would determine whether the cycle truly ended. I told her calmly that she couldn't come and that I hoped she found support, but it wouldn't be with me. She cried, accused, pleaded, oscillated between remorse and defensiveness, said things like, I didn't mean it like that, and you know how mom gets, and I was under pressure, and the old me would have translated those excuses into responsibility, but the new me heard them for what they were, explanations without accountability, and I told her something I'd never said before. I said, I love you, but I don't trust you, and without trust, there's no relationship. She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, because in her family, love had never required trust, it had required endurance. And when she realized I wouldn't budge, anger flashed through her tears. She accused me of abandoning her, of being cruel, of choosing myself over blood, and I let her say it all without interrupting, because sometimes people need to exhaust their narratives before they can hear yours. And when she finished, I said quietly, I didn't abandon you. I stepped away from harm, and there's a difference, and I closed the door, not slammed, not dramatic, just closed it and leaned against it shaking, because strength doesn't mean you don't feel, it means you don't let feelings dictate choices. And that night, after my son was asleep, I sat with the weight of that interaction and understood something else. Healing isn't linear, and closure isn't a conversation. It's a pattern of consistent choices made over time, and that door might open someday under different circumstances with different boundaries, but not now, not without change. And as weeks turned into months, life continued to unfold in ways that felt almost ordinary, and that ordinariness was extraordinary. School, plays, birthday parties, quiet weekends, grocery shopping with my son, singing off key in the cart. Those moments became proof that joy doesn't need an audience, it just needs space. And then something shifted again, not externally, but internally. I stopped defining my story by what I escaped and started defining it by what I was building. I enrolled in a certification course, something I'd always wanted to do, but never felt worthy of investing in myself. I redecorated our small living room, hung photos that made me smile, painted the walls a color I loved without asking anyone's opinion. And those acts, small as they were, reclaimed agency piece by piece. And when people asked about my family, I stopped over-explaining. I simply said we're not in contact and left it at that. No apology, no justification, and the remembered weight of that statement surprised me, because it felt final, not sad, just factual. And then came the messages from viewers, from strangers who'd watched my story and saw themselves in it. People who said things like, I thought I was the only one, or I'd been the family punching bag for years, or I didn't know it was okay to walk away. And reading those messages was humbling, because it reminded me that stories have power, not because they're dramatic, but because they're honest, and honesty gives people permission to question narratives they've internalized for too long. And if you're listening to this, wondering whether it's too late to choose yourself, it's not. If you're wondering whether setting boundaries will make you lonely, maybe at first, but loneliness fades when it's replaced by peace. If you're afraid of being seen as the villain, remember that some people only call you that when you stop playing the role they assigned you. And here's the part that matters most, the part one want you to sit with. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It means you stop abandoning yourself. And that distinction changes everything. My son will grow up watching a mother who values herself, who models respect, who doesn't tolerate cruelty disguised as humor or loyalty, and that legacy matters more than any family tradition or shared last name. And if you're still here, Still listening, still feeling that pull in your chest, I want you to tell me. In the comments, what part of this story hit closest to home, not for engagement, not for algorithms, but because naming it out loud is the first step toward reclaiming it. And stay with me, because the next story I'm sharing isn't about walking away. It's about what happens when the people who underestimated you realize too late that you were the foundation all along. And what that realization costs them. There's a moment that comes after you've chosen yourself long enough that the world starts testing whether you meant it or whether it was just a phase. And that moment doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic confrontations. It arrives quietly, disguised as opportunity, disguised as regret, disguised as people suddenly remembering your value when it's convenient for them. And this is where the story sharpens, because this is where the power truly shifts, not when you walk away, but when the people who discarded you start circling back, not out of love, but out of loss that started with small signals, things I wouldn't have noticed before. A voicemail from a family friend who hadn't spoken to me in years, saying she hoped I was well, a LinkedIn view from someone connected to my sister, a casual message from a cousin asking how I was doing, as if nothing had happened, as if the wedding hadn't detonated everything. And at first I ignored it, because peace teaches you discernment. It teaches you that not every knock deserves an answer. And then the real reason surfaced, and when it did, it confirmed everything I'd suspected but never needed to prove. My sister's life had begun to crack, not publicly, not in a dramatic headline way, but in the subtle ways that matter most. Her social circle thinned, invitations slowed, her workplace became colder, whispers followed her into rooms, because reputations don't collapse from one event, they collapse when that event confirms patterns. People already sensed the wedding was an anomaly, it was a reveal, and once people see you clearly, they can't unsee it. And suddenly the same family that laughed along with her cruelty needed something from me: empathy, support, validation, a shield. And that's when the request started indirect at first, then bolder. My mother left a message through a mutual acquaintance saying she just wanted to talk, that she missed her grandson, that families fight, but blood is blood. And I could hear the unspoken subtext beneath every word: help us stabilize the narrative, help us look normal again. And that was the moment I understood something crucial. They didn't miss me. They missed access. They missed the version of me that absorbed damage quietly and smoothed over consequences. And I wasn't that person anymore. And it terrified them, because systems that rely on one person's silence collapse. When that silence ends, I saw it clearly then: the hierarchy that had defined my childhood, the golden child, the scapegoat, the silent enabler. It only functioned as long as I stayed in my assigned role. The moment I stepped out, the imbalance became impossible to hide, and instead of adjusting, they wanted to pull me back in to restore order. But order for them had always meant harm for me, and that clarity didn't make me angry. It made me resolute, because once you see the mechanics of a system, you stop personalizing its failures. And this is where I want you listening to slow down for a second, because if you've ever been the one holding everything together, the responsible one, the fixer, the emotional regulator, understand this. When you leave, the system doesn't miss you because of love, it misses you because you were load-bearing, and when you remove a load-bearing structure, the cracks spread fast. That's not your fault, that's math. And my family learned that math the hard way, because without me absorbing tension, conflicts escalated. My sister clashed with my parents. My parents turned on each other. Old resentments, surface conversations ended in shouting matches. Instead of jokes, the harmony they pretended existed only existed because I kept swallowing discomfort. And once I stopped, the truth flooded in, and they wanted me back, not to heal, but to contain it again. And that's when I did something I'd never done before. I said nothing. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't offer closure. I let their discomfort stand on its own, because growth doesn't happen when someone rescues you from consequences. And this is the part people don't talk about enough. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're mirrors. They force people to confront themselves. And most people hate mirrors because mirrors don't lie. And weeks passed, and then months, and my life continued expanding quietly. My confidence deepened. My son thrived. I laughed more easily. I slept better. And one evening, after putting my son to bed, I sat alone on the couch, scrolling through messages, and saw one that stopped me cold. It was from my sister, sent through a new number. And it didn't accuse, it didn't beg, it simply said, I don't recognize myself anymore, and I don't know who I am without tearing you down. And that sentence landed heavy, because it was the first honest thing she'd ever said, and for a moment I felt the old pull the urge to help to guide, to be the emotional compass again. But I paused because insight without action is just awareness, and awareness doesn't entitle someone to your labor. And I responded carefully. I said, I hope you figure that out, but I can't be part of that process. And it wasn't cruel, it was truthful, and truth is kinder than false hope. And after that, the messages stopped and something settled. Finality, maybe not forever, but for now. And this is where the story loops back to you, because if you're still listening, it's probably because some part of this feels familiar. The public humiliation, the family gaslighting, the way pain gets reframed as humor, the way you're told you're too sensitive when you react to cruelty. And I need you to hear this clearly. Being hurt by disrespect doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And refusing to accept it doesn't make you selfish, it makes you sane. And the reason stories like this resonate isn't because they're extreme, it's because they expose dynamics people normalize every day. And if you're wondering what comes next after walking away, it's not revenge, not triumph, not applause. It's something quieter and far more powerful: self-trust. And once you trust yourself, you stop needing permission to leave rooms that shrink you. You stop needing validation from people invested in your silence. And you start building a life that doesn't require you to disappear to function. And that's the part they never expect. They expect you to break or return. They don't expect you to grow, and growth is the one outcome they can't control. So before this continues, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments, not for me, but for yourself. Who benefits from your silence? And what would happen if you stopped providing it and stay with me? Because what comes next isn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. It's about the moment they finally realize that the story they told about you is the only thing holding them together, and without it, everything they built starts to unravel. The moment the illusion finally collapsed, it didn't happen in a public explosion or a dramatic confrontation. It happened in a slow, irreversible unraveling that no one could stop. Because once the truth is visible, it doesn't need witnesses to keep spreading. It carries itself. And this is where the story lands, not with shouting or tears, but with consequence, the kind that settles in quietly and reshapes everything it touches. My family learned something they never expected, that the narrative they built around me wasn't just cruel, it was structural. It was the glue that held their hierarchy together. The scapegoat, the golden child, the silent accomplice. Remove one piece, and the structure destabilizes. Remove the wrong one, and it implodes. And they felt that implosion in ways they couldn't hide anymore. Invitations stopped coming their social circle, shifted. People asked questions they couldn't answer without revealing themselves. And suddenly the laughter they once enjoyed turned into awkward silences and side glances, because people don't mind cruelty when it's subtle, but they recoil when it's undeniable, and the wedding made it undeniable. It gave the cruelty a face, a sound, a timestamp, and from that moment on, every attempt they made to regain control failed, because control requires belief, and belief evaporates when evidence exists. And what fascinated me wasn't their downfall, it was my detachment, because the version of me that would have felt guilty, the version that would have rushed in to soothe, to fix, to mediate, that version no longer existed. And I realized something important: closure isn't about seeing others regret their actions. It's about no longer needing them to. And that's when the final shift occurred, not in them, but in me. I stopped replaying the past, stopped rewriting conversations, stopped imagining alternate outcomes where they finally chose me, because the truth was simpler and harder. They couldn't choose me without dismantling who they thought they were. And most people would rather preserve their identity than repair a relationship, even with their own child. And accepting that didn't make me bitter, it made me free. Because once you understand that someone's inability to love you properly isn't a reflection of your worth, you stop auditioning for their approval and start directing your own life. And my life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. My confidence stopped being performative and became rooted. I made decisions without running them through imaginary panels of judgment. I trusted my instincts because they'd carried me through worse. And my son noticed before anyone else. He became more relaxed, more expressive. He laughed louder, asked more questions, took up space without apology. And watching that was the most profound confirmation that I'd done the right thing. Because children learn how to exist by watching how their parents exist. And I wanted him to learn that dignity isn't something you earn by enduring harm, it's something you protect by walking away from it. And then something happened that brought everything full circle. A family acquaintance, someone who'd attended the wedding, approached me months later at a grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, hesitant, but determined, and she said, "I just wanted you to know." I laughed that night, and I've thought about it every day since. I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything, and that sentence mattered more than any apology I'd never receive from my family, because it acknowledged complicity and awareness. And that's the thing about cruelty. It survives on silence, but it weakens when people name their role in it. And I told her simply, "Thank you for telling me," and walked away without resentment, without forgiveness, without drama. Just clarity, and clarity is the quiet power people underestimate, because it doesn't demand attention, it doesn't perform. It just exists, and that existence changes how you move through the world, how you choose who gets access to you, how you define family, how you define love. And if you're still listening now, still following this thread, it's probably because you recognize some version of yourself in it. The one who's been laughed at, minimized, scapegoated, the one who's been told to lighten up when something hurt, the one who's been asked to be the bigger person so others could stay small. And here's what I want you to carry with you, not as motivation, not as inspiration, but as truth. You are not required to participate in narratives that harm you, even if they're written by people who share your blood. You are allowed to leave rooms that refuse to respect you. You are allowed to build a life that doesn't include people who only value you when you're silent. And you are allowed to choose peace over proximity every single time. And the reason this story doesn't end with revenge or reconciliation is because those aren't the real victories. The real victory is indifference, not apathy, but freedom from needing validation from people who never intended to give it. And if you're wondering whether they ever understood the damage they caused, maybe in fragments, maybe in moments, but understanding isn't the same as change, and change isn't something you can force, it has to be chosen. And I chose myself, and in doing so I gave my son a future unburdened by the same patterns, and that is enough. And before you go, I want you to do one thing. Tell me in the comments, not your whole story, just one word that describes how this made you feel. Because sometimes naming the feeling is the first act of reclaiming your voice. And stay close, because the next story I'm sharing isn't about family at all. It's about what happens when the world tries to define you by your worst moment, and you decide to redefine yourself instead.